For centuries, when you hear the name Mongols, one image probably comes to mind: brutal, destructive conquest. But what if that story, the one we've all been told, is just wrong? Today, we're going to challenge that whole idea, using firsthand accounts and some pretty amazing modern science to uncover a civilization that's been lost to history. Yeah, this is the picture we all have in our heads, right? A relentless, unstoppable horde just sweeping out of the east. And this narrative wasn't an accident. It was carefully crafted by the established powers of the time, from the mandarins in China to the chroniclers back in Europe. So that's where things get really interesting. We're basically putting this entire myth on trial. On one side, you have centuries of accepted history. But on the other, we have eyewitness testimony from two men who actually went there, and their stories are being backed up by hard data from satellites orbiting the Earth right now. To really get to the bottom of this, we first have to understand the legend that had 13th century Europe in its grip. It was a time of, well, massive fear, but also this desperate, almost magical kind of hope. So you've got this bizarre situation brewing in Europe. They were losing the Crusades, and they were desperately praying for a savior, this mythical Christian king from the east named Prester John. So when Genghis Khan's armies suddenly appeared on the horizon, the first thought was actually hope. They thought, wait, could this be him? Is this our salvation? Well, surprise, the armies that showed up were definitely not led by a Christian king. Faced with this terrifying new reality, the Pope did something pretty bold. He sent a couple of envoys on a ridiculously dangerous journey, deep into the heart of the Mongol Empire, just to figure out what was really going on. All right, so let's meet our star witnesses, two Franciscan friars, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine and William of Rubric. Now, these guys weren't conquerors or merchants. They were observers, sent on an intelligence mission to understand this new global power. And what they wrote back home was about to send a shockwave through Europe. So, what's the first bombshell they drop? The whole Prester John thing? Total fantasy. Rubric was incredibly blunt about it, saying the stories about this great Christian savior were just wildly overblown. In fact, in letters back to the Pope, the Mongols themselves made it crystal clear. There was no other power. They were it. And if this Prester John character ever existed, and he was likely based on a real tribal leader named Togrul, he was just the subject of the Great Khan. Just like that, the dream was over. Okay, so if the big myth was busted, what did Carpini and Rubric actually find? Because let me tell you, what they described wasn't some savage horde living in tents. It was a society of incredible organization, tolerance, and engineering that, in a lot of ways, was way ahead of their own. Rubric's description of the capital, Karakorum, is just mind-boggling. He talks about a walled city with separate neighborhoods for Chinese craftsmen and Saracen merchants. He found 12 temples for different religions, a couple of mosques, and a church, all operating right next to each other. I mean, for a guy from Europe where people were killing each other over minor religious disagreements, this must have been completely unthinkable. And then there's this. This is the showstopper. Right in the middle of the Khan's palace was this massive mechanical silver tree. When the Khan gave the signal, 4 silver pipes would start pouring out different drinks, wine, fermented mare's milk, you name it. This wasn't just for show. It was proof that the Mongols were actively recruiting the best engineers from all over their empire. And that crazy tree was just the tip of the iceberg. This was a highly organized state. Carpini couldn't believe how strict their law code was. Theft was basically non-existent. Their military victories came from smarts and superior engineering, not just numbers. They built the world's first real global market, all protected by this incredible postal system called the Jam. And in places like China, they built entire cities like Dadu, that's modern-day Beijing, on a perfect grid with sanitation. It was a whole different world from the chaotic cities of Europe. All right, so here's the big puzzle. If you have these super detailed, credible reports from guys like Carpini and Rubric making their way back to Europe, why did the myth of the savage barbarian not only survive, but actually get stronger? You've heard that saying, history is written by the victors, right? Well, the Mongol Empire is the one huge exception to that rule. They won almost every single battle, but in the end, they completely lost the war over how history would remember them. Honestly, it was basically a psychological defense mechanism. For these ancient, settled civilizations in places like China and Persia, the idea that a nomadic culture could govern them more efficiently, well, that was just humiliating. It was way easier to call them savages than to admit that they were better at administration and technology. So for centuries, the friars' reports were mostly dismissed as fantasy, just travelers' tales of silver trees and invisible cities. But today, almost 800 years later, modern technology is proving that they were telling the absolute truth. How do you find a city that's been completely swallowed by the earth? Well, it turns out you stop digging in the dirt and you start looking down from the sky. And this is just incredible. Here we can put Rubrich's words from the 1200s right next to modern geophysical scans, which use sensors to see what's under the ground. And the scans show the unmistakable foundations of a huge planned city, complete with the very production centers Rubric wrote about. It's a perfect match. And the scale of this place is immense. The surveys found a city covering over 465 hectares. That's way bigger than historians ever thought possible. A massive urban center was hiding just inches below the grass the whole time. You can even see this incredible urban planning from orbit. This is a satellite image of Xanadu, Kublai Khan's summer capital. Even after all this time, you can clearly trace the perfect geometric layout of the three concentric sections: the palace city, the imperial city, and the outer city. It's just breathtaking. And their engineering went way beyond cities. This is satellite data from the Juan Oasis. It's revealed a 392-kilometer network of canals. That's not just a few ditches. We're talking about continent-scale hydroengineering that literally turned arid lands green to feed a huge population, all managed by a sophisticated Mongol administration. The conclusion here is pretty undeniable. Hard science has finally completely vindicated these eyewitnesses. The things that Europe dismissed as fairy tales were actually accurate reports of a highly advanced civilization that cared more about function and infrastructure than building fancy monuments. You know, the story of the Mongols was written by their rivals, and that version stuck for 800 years. It really makes you wonder, what other parts of our history are just convenient narratives? What other truths are lying just below the surface, waiting for the right tools to bring them back into the light?